what we're seeing is that there is a balance when it comes to data privacy. There is a tie-in to data sovereignty in that a lot of the regulations want to make sure that you keep data, whether it's on premise, within the confines of a physical location, a country, and how you put those controls in place. So there is a balance, I think, that we're seeing between what can go into public cloud or applications versus what you want to keep sort of in still on-prem within servers that you have access to. The other aspect I'll say is just around data minimization when there's a balance. We're finding, and we hear a lot about it, a lot of it in the industry, don't let organization keep your data longer than they need to. If a government needs your data for 30 years, so be it. But probably your retailer doesn't need that data for more than maybe a few years. So it really is around data minimization and tying that back into some of those regulations and managing that data, as long as it's needed, but no longer than that.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. Even thinking about what you said there too. So there's so many security practices that kind of already exist. We've been doing data sovereignty for a really long time, so we can translate some of those practices into better data privacy principle practices, as well as the data minimization piece too. I think a lot of people have been caught, with that too, right? Not or archiving data for too long, to where we see several archived folders getting publicly exposed and exploited. So yeah, a good data lifecycle practice makes a lot of sense there.
And if I can jump on that, that's putting a lot on the user, and I understand it's your data, you should be controlling and using it out there. That goes back to the early design decisions of like, should we be collecting this data? Do we need this data? Sometimes we add an additional field in because it was one extra box to click in the dropdown, or we thought it would look good, but what are we really going to do with it? Are we really challenging ourselves in these discussions?
Yeah, and I think that's a fair point, right? I feel like, when we used to talk about security, we said not all data can be created equal, right? So you cannot protect everything the same way. I think, as storage costs started to reduce, we have this, sort of inherent psychology for us to just collect as much data as possible in every app, in every initiative we do. I really do believe that if we go back to sort of that risk-based, principles and really think about, so you're collecting this data and are you approaching privacy as that one checkpoint where you just, check the box and say, hey, have you accounted for privacy? Or are you really thinking about this whole thing as a journey, right? It's beyond a checkbox. It's beyond one checkpoint. It's beyond that compliance, right? It has to really sort of going back to our privacy by design. It has to be embedded into how you as an organization manage data, right? Whether it is for security reasons or privacy reasons. I think fundamentally going back to that construct, that are you truly risk-based when you look at data? Do you apply the same sensitivity across all of the data that you're trying to protect? I think which is why we start to see why privacy and security models fail, right? Because we are trying to apply a model. Either we blame it on the user, or we say that we want to collect and use information for whatever value may be without really thinking about it from a risk standpoint.
Dwayne and Bindu, I think you hit on really good points there. I'm just thinking, do we have proper categorization and classification of data? Because it is difficult to protect everything. And so minimizing what we protect. And that's, I think, the biggest part of where we'll have to change some of our practices. We're so used to just, hey, how much analytics can we get out of the data that we have versus minimizing really what we need to look at. Not only from a privacy perspective, but that could save a lot on cost and resources if we do that correctly. Nataraj, anything you can add to that too as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the key point around data classification that Bindu hit on as well, because from a risk perspective that comes down, when we work with customers, a simple way to think about is that a public data, confidential data, or sensitive data, right? There may be many labels to these things, but if you think about that spectrum, PII, personally identifiable information, is a classic example, which is sensitive, like most sensitive, that needs to be safeguarded. Then it has two dimensions. One is the enterprise, how the enterprise is going to control this data so that only their applications have access to it with user control on the other side. So when we think about that level of specificity, that your data is yours and only the customers can have their access to the data, in a cloud environment, even the cloud provider must not have access. So we have technologies like what we call keep your own key, where we provide highest level of technical assurance that such data like PII can even be encrypted at a field level. All the way the keys are managed only by the customer. We don't even have access to the hardware security modules, as an example, right? And even in use, you can apply technologies like confidential computing. So when we bring this together, that level of specificity gets applied for those sensitive data. Whereas if it's public data, you don't need to have all bells and whistles in terms of it because your risk is low. So taking that balance and applying the right level of controls and important controls around protecting the data from that perspective becomes really, really important.
Yeah, I liked how you shared some of those technology examples too. I know confidential computing is something that's a little more unique today. I know it's been around for a while, but I feel like we're at a time where technology is really aiding how we can actually apply new technologies, not just for security like we've been talking about too, but now applying those to privacy as well.
That's right, John. Just one add to that, because you mentioned even at the beginning of the call about AI. We are 15 minutes into it and we didn't get into it as an example. But why should PII data even be part of any training? Stop it, right? That's a classic example of privacy by design, security at heart. When you build models or even you're inferencing, focus on it, and PII should be completely off the charts, should never be included, as an example.
Yeah.
And I think, that's a great point, right, Nataraj, when you're talking about, PII and how it should not be included. We are actually part of this generation where everything is tracked, right? You wake up in the morning, you've tracked your sleep cycle, you are, walking, you're tracking your steps. But at the same time, from a consumer standpoint, they don't really think that every part of all of this is actually being used, for a different purpose than what they signed up for, right? I remember in the early on days, sort of this mirror that is in the trial rooms that can help you pick the right outfit. Of course, if you think about it, from a use case standpoint, makes sense. But then you're like, okay, where is this data going again? Are you now going to be like, a certain ethnicity with a certain size, with a certain type of a career, buys, certain type of clothes? And then I can understand that from a marketing standpoint and, being able to cater to your personal preference is great. But now, how long are you going to keep this data? What are you doing with it? How often are you going and mining that, right? That makes it all, especially with AI, I worry that if we don't put a stop to it from a governance standpoint today, 10 years down the line, forget PII. We don't know what else is going to be captured beyond that and applied to, right? So the tag of, using all of this data into an AI model, that is actually not going to be governed from an enterprise level. Even now, organizations are struggling, right? It's already in there. And this is not just for the large enterprises. We hear about it, in all of the talks about how AI is being used. You would not even think about what types of organizations are using this and for what purposes. It could be like, an extermination company. It could actually be somebody that's using it for training programs and trying to, use the modules to translate. But the amount of information that we're collecting, that we're putting into these models is scary.
Yeah, and building on top of what Bindu was saying, it's not only the organization that captures your data, but it's also whoever may purchase them in the future. So there's a lot of concern going around right now with 23andMe, that they may end up being purchased by another organization. And what happens to all of your data that they have gathered on you over all of these years that now goes to a third party, and you may not necessarily have control over what they do with it once they acquire that data from this other organization. So that also needs to be part of it, is that organizations need to think about this being a possibility in the future, and not only write into their privacy policies that we will delete such and such data at such and such time, but they need to actually follow through with those policies and actually do it, and not just accidentally forget, oh, well, we still have your data 15 years later after we said we told it for 18 months.